in Ukraine the second day, and maybe will be start, Madeline. Thank you so much for this meeting, and thank you very much for support Ukraine every time.
You're very welcome. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes, it's okay.
Would you like me to start?
Yes, okay.
Okay. So I have been asked to talk about the function of the President of the NATO Parliament, and in particular, what the UK's role is in the NATO Parliament. So I'm going to start by saying I was president in 2018 to 2019, and that was a very different time. It was a time when NATO hadn't new members, such as we've just had, in terms of the Finns who'd now joined. But politically, things were very different here in the UK. And everything I say from now onwards, I will talk about how it felt in the past and how it feels now, because things have definitely changed. So the main thing you need to understand is how the president is actually elected. There are three main political groups in the Assembly. They tend to be loosely called the Socialist Group, the Conservative Group, and the Christian Democrat or Liberal Democrat groups. And the presidency rotates between those three groups. So I was selected by an election held within the Socialist Group as their candidate to be president. And from there, having been elected by the Socialist Group or selected, I went to the whole of the Assembly who voted for my nomination. So it's a two-stage process. You know, a lot of the time in politics, people want the title. They don't always want the job. I hope you can understand the difference. The job is something that you can either put a lot, like all jobs, of time and effort and energy into, or you can just enjoy the title and you can enjoy the grandeur of the role. I would say there are three strands to the role. The same as being president of any organization. So internally, the role is to provide leadership, to be a collective voice, someone who is problem solving, moving issues forward, but always striving to maintain unity. That's not always easy in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, because the delegates from the 30 countries who are members come from very different political groupings. So you are trying to create a harmony between far left and far right, and every shade of political difference in between. You're also trying to maintain harmony from those whose views are north those who are south, the Americans who fund most of it, and those where there is long-standing historical tensions. And you do that by constantly emphasizing that we are there to not only represent our countries and our political groups, but also to recognize the importance of collective decision-making within NATO and within the Parliament. And everyone has a responsibility to ensure that happens. So then we have the next role, which is very much an administrative one. So it's processing the business, making sure that business can move forward, and that the necessary changes can be made to make sure that business is held successfully. Sometimes it's simply decision-making. We have a request from outside of the NATO Parliament for a visit or for a meeting or to endorse something that has happened. And then, because you can't pull a meeting together quickly, it will usually be the president or the president and the bureau, which is, I suppose, the equivalent of, in the UK, we would call it the cabinet. The 5 deputy presidents and the treasurer. Always you have to involve the treasurer. He's the man who controls the money, very powerful position. And then it's chairing lots of meetings. And then finally, there's the external role. Now that's got a number of different aspects. So you're physically the manifestation of the Parliamentary Assembly. So you are representing its values, its policies, and its priorities. You'll be asking questions, and in a diplomatic role, hoping to move relationships forward, where perhaps in the past there may have been tension, or where there may be aspirations to join the Parliamentary Assembly, or there might be political differences between members of the Parliamentary Assembly that you are being asked to help resolve. Sometimes you're challenging people because aspects of behavior or political decision-making may be creating tensions within the Assembly, but everything has to be done in a way that retains that central harmony of purpose and retains a collective vision of how we move forward. Honesty is central to the way you do that. So you're not going to lie. You're going to be sometimes have to be brutally honest about why a problem exists. And sometimes you're having to say no. And I can give examples where a country asked for a private meeting with me, not a member of the NATO Parliament. And they wanted me to lobby for NATO to deal with a situation within their country that just was not going to be possible. And you have to explain why this is not going to be possible. But always behind all of this is learning. everything you do, you have to learn lessons from. Everywhere you visit, the aim is to go home with greater understanding and to have personal contacts that are absolutely critical to all of those other roles. Because if I can, as president, ring a senior politician in another country and say, there is some problem, there is some tension, or pass on congratulations for something that has happened, or pass on condolences for something that has happened. It is important that those relationships are positive and maintained. Because there are many people who want to drive the members of NATO apart. So the role of the president is to add to the understanding of the parliamentarians from across the alliance of how to work together and to tolerate each other's differences. Because we come from different histories, we come from different political systems, and yet we somehow have to make it work together. Where does the UK sit in all of this? In the past, I joined the Parliamentary Assembly, I think 2010. I would say that the three loudest voices, the most trusted voices, would be probably the Americans, the French, and the British. If only because we tend to talk a lot as nationalities. We're great talkers. But that was before Brexit. That was before Donald Trump. And that was before France too had its problems with the election of President Macron. Because President Macron brought into the National Assembly in France lots of politicians with no experience of defense and security and had no understanding of how NATO operated. So instead of having a delegation that everyone knew and who knew everyone, we suddenly had a delegation from France who nobody knew. And what happens then is other countries come up and fill that gap. So the Dutch became much more vocal. The Germans became more vocal. The Baltic states became more vocal. And you see that happening all the time. Being a trusted voice within the NATO Parliament, someone who can be relied upon to talk common sense, who has a collective knowledge, is very important. And it's very important that members know each other. So Oksana, who is a long-standing friend of mine, she was one of those people who, when she joined the Assembly, went out and made sure that she got to know people and that people got to know her and got to know the problems that she felt needed tackling in terms of Ukraine and where Ukraine was in its aspiration to be a member. that matters, because you see that person and you understand what the problems are. So you want to build a relationship that is helpful not for the person, but for the country they represent. And that is very, very important, and is a crucial reason to be part of the NATO family and of the parliamentary family. Because although Oksana lost her seat, just as I did, the relationships stay, the relationships remain important, and the conversations carry on. And during the lockdown, during the COVID times, I was constantly having messages from parliamentarians across the alliance saying, how are things? Are everything okay in the UK? And asking for the personal insight of what is really happening. How are things going? So those relationships are lasting and ongoing. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to you and let you ask any questions that you may have. I hope that's been helpful.
Yes, thank you very much, Madeline. Maybe a young people, please, please question. Yes, Лена Оселедцева, Катерина Стрілець, Дар'я Панова. And next.
Okay, Madeline, thanks for your speech very much. And I have a question. So what security challenges and threats are most relevant for NATO member countries in modern conditions?
We're in a difficult place now because we are fighting a war none of us really expected. All of us are fighting that war. And all of us must make sure that those who started that war fail. So everywhere across NATO, there are problems in terms of particularly munitions. And there is a big lesson that all of the NATO countries have learned, which is that we have to look again at how we replace our munition stocks so that we're not in a position where we cannot supply Ukraine, and how we ensure that all of our allies will have the level of support that they need. I think Ukraine has taught many countries in the alliance the importance of resilience. And I think certainly in the West, we have forgotten the importance of citizen armies, not just the fighters on the front line with the guns, but also those people who are helping the refugees, those people who are helping day-to-day life continue in a country under attack. And those people who are still there challenging governments and saying, what comes after this war? What will we have? What are we fighting for? What do we want to establish? And that's very much a role for young people, to be thinking about what are the important priorities after the war. So we know where we are in terms of the aggression from Russia. We are learning lessons about our capabilities and our stockpiles and our civilian populations. But we also have to look at future problems. So we have the rise of artificial intelligence. We are all very aware of the economic attacks that have taken place on Ukraine and across the alliance. So our economies, our energy supplies have taken attacks. So there is a greater recognition that we need to build stronger, more robust economies, that we need to have stronger cyber defenses. Drone warfare has developed to a new pitch. And at the same time, we are facing questions over China. This is my personal opinion, but I think also we have to look at the United Nations and how that is going to operate when we have within the Security Council gridlock, an impossibility to make critical decisions. And that too is a problem that we are ultimately going to have to face. I hope that has answered your question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your speech and answers. And my question is, do you consider NATO support to Ukraine to be enough since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014?
What is enough? When is enough ever enough? That's an impossible question. Because each of those countries within the alliance is having to deal with their local populations, their local parliaments, and their decision-making processes. For some, it has been easier than for others. So in the UK, on the whole, the decision has been easy because the two main political parties, the Conservatives and the Socialist Party, the Labour Party, are united in their determination. So for us, decision-making tends to be are the blocks working together? And we only have two blocks. But in some countries, there may be a parliament that's made up of 40 different political parties. And if you're trying to get a consensus amongst 40 different political parties to make the decision to do something, to give support, there's a lot of what we in the UK call horse trading. So you have to give a little bit here, you have to give a little bit there, and it can take a long time to get a decision. Again, it's a personal view. I think we need to get better at providing training earlier than the request for weaponry. And I give, for example, the Ukraine's request for aircraft. Now, it is no good giving someone an aircraft that they can't fly. And how long does it take to train a fighter pilot? So we have to be better at making sure training comes sooner. I was in London at a meeting 3 weeks ago. And as I came into the station, there was a group of soldiers standing. And I went over to talk to them and asked them why they were in the station. They were collecting money for a military charity. And they said, what was I doing? Where was I going? And I said I was going to meet a delegation from Ukraine who had come to the UK to talk about the war and its progress and the future. And my unit is training the Ukrainians. We've had a number of groups come through the training, and now we're getting some of the units back for a second tranche. And I said, and how's that going? He said, it's amazing. The ones who are coming back are now teaching us as much as we're teaching them. Because the experience in every war is different. And the personnel who are coming from Ukraine are learning and showing the new problems that they have faced and how they've dealt with it, and asking, are there other things we could be doing? And challenging the personnel of the training nations to think, how would we deal with that? Have they done anything better than we can do? And if so, what are we to learn? So enough is never enough. Especially at a time of economic crisis. The big enough at the moment is, are we also doing enough to help and prepare Ukraine for after the war? I would say. So again, I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you for your answer.
Максим, вибач, вимкни, будь ласка, звук.
Я что-то подошел к нему обратно, я слышу,
Виключіть, будь ласка, звук. Світлана, можна виключити звук?
Так, я шукаю хвилинку.
Okay, it's my turn. Dear Medellin, thank you for your visit. It's a great honor for us to meet you here. And also my question will be the following. How do you assess the current activities of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and to what extent does it meet the challenges of the time and current changes in the field of security, economy, and technology? Sorry, we don't hear you.
I think someone muted me. People have been trying to do that for years. I don't attend the NATO Assembly at the moment, but I follow what they are doing. And it is good to see that they have visited Ukraine. So they maintain their interest and maintain their outreach, coming to you to find out what your views are. Because it's not just about a one-way dialogue. It's not just a case of Ukraine doing what NATO says. It's about Ukraine saying, this is what we need. This is how we see things. Because if you don't understand the other person's perspective and what they're seeing and what they need, you're not going to make the right decisions. So I'm pleased that that is happening. And the Assembly has been very clear in its support for Ukraine. I think that is important, not just because the NATO Parliamentary Assembly says, you know, we support Ukraine, but because those MPs go back into their individual parliaments to be a voice for Ukraine. And especially if they've managed to take part in the conversations that you've had. Because it's like I was saying about my conversations with Oksana. If they've been talking to Oksana recently and she has said, this is what we need, they will have heard it from someone that they trust. If they meet you as students and you say, these are our priorities, they hear that. Okay, bear that in mind when I'm making my decisions. And they take it back into their parliaments and feed it into their parliament that this is what is happening and this is what is being asked for. And this is what people are having to cope with. It is really, really important, those personal conversations in politics, they matter in a way that you cannot underestimate. Trust in politics is in very short supply, but when you find it, it's like gold dust. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you a lot.
Thank you. Next, please, Владислава Каліщук, Катерина Опейда, Олег Майборода.
Okay, Madeline, thanks you for your lecture and thanks you for your time. It is very valuable to talk with you, such a great woman like you. And I have one question is, will the meetings in the Rammstein format continue after the war on Ukraine? And what effects will it have on the post-war period?
I'm sorry, the sound was terrible and I couldn't absolutely be certain of the question. Would you mind repeating?
Okay. Will the meetings in the Rammstein format continue after the war in Ukraine? And what effect will it have on the post-war period?
I think the post-war period is going to be absolutely vital that the support continues. If I look at the history of the UK, we fought a big war, 1914-18. And after the war, there was no plan. And the country descended into chaos, and the poverty for people who had fought valiantly was terrible. So during the war of 1940-45, governments were planning for the peace. And there is a common saying, you can win a war and lose the peace. So of course, Ukraine must have support to win the peace, so that your people have fought for a new Ukraine. The question you have to be dealing with internally now is, what will that look like? What is it you want to come out of this war? And don't just say to me membership of NATO, because that's That's an obscure aspiration. It has to affect you personally. So you need to see that you fought for values, for the end of corruption, for housing, for clean water in houses. It is everything at that level of the everyday in your life, right through to we want to be members of the European Union, members of NATO. But also you're going to have to look at, how do we want our politics to work? How do we want young people to have a role in building stronger communities? And all of those things are going to be discussed in the next few years. And those discussions are starting now. And it's why I'm here today. Because we need to start planning for the peace and not just planning and fighting a war. Does that help?
Yes, very much.
Thank you.
Dear Medellin, thank you so much for such an interesting speech. And it's really valuable to hear you today. So I have two questions which relates to your own experience. So you mentioned that it's really important to have a good relationship between members and with members. So the first question is, when you were president, were there any situations when conflicts were between members? If yes, can you give any recommendations on how to resolve them and how to go on working in this situation? And the second question is, what is the most important lesson you learned when you were a president?
Okay, so when I was outside of the conference hall, and the vote was taking place inside to decide whether or not I would be president. And a politician from a country that was not a NATO member came to see me and asked for my help and said there was a problem with a NATO member country who was causing problems for this other country, a partnership for peace seeking country. And said, could I do anything? And I said, I'll see what I can do. And when I was elected and people were congratulating me, I said to the head of the delegation of the country that was causing problems, and I said, can you sort this out for me? We really don't need that sort of conflict. And I know I can rely on you to sort it for me because you're a man of integrity and honesty. So can you look at it? And the next day he said to me, I will talk with my capital. And the next day he came back and he said, it's sorted, it's done, it's gone away. So sometimes just a little conversation. Not a finger pointing conversation, but a can you help conversation. Another time a country had used political force, used their military in an offensive way. I mean, a military offense, not a personal offense. They'd invaded, they'd gone over a border, and some countries were really not happy about that. So I called the delegation from that country to meet me, and I said, okay, you are going to go into every meeting for the next 2 days of all of the subcommittees and all of the committee meetings, and you will sit for 15 minutes and take questions from the delegates. And you will answer those questions. And I'm relying on you answering politely, honestly, and listening to the complaints. And they did. Fair dues, they did. And the tension went away because people got their chance to say, this is not acceptable. Tell your government we do not want this. And then they got on with the rest of the business. So give people a voice is very important. Shutting down voices just, it's like trying to plug a volcano, you know, the voices just get more and more tense and eventually they'll explode. But if you let people ventilate and express their opinion, life is a lot easier. What did I learn? The biggest lesson. It wasn't while I was president. I don't know if you remember, Oksana, we had a conference in Lviv. And I was at the airport waiting to leave. And I was sitting talking with 2 MPs from a former Soviet state. And normally when we talked about policies, we talked about things that the Parliamentary Assembly was doing. But they talked about their childhoods. And they talked about how living in a repressive communist state affected your capacity to think, and the brakes that you put on your thinking and on your relationships and on your words. I cannot tell you what that did to me, because I come from a country where people say whatever they feel like about anything. And in some respects could do with shutting up a little bit. And that was an important lesson for me, that not everyone has the confidence to feel that they are still safe. And I saw that most when I visited another former Soviet state. And I always like to go into either a school or a college or a university or a workplace and talk to young people, because it's one of the passions that I have. And I was in a university, and when I did this Q&A session, the first question was, if the Soviets invade, will NATO be there for us? I said, yeah, of course we will. You're a NATO member. Of course we will. They were second, possibly some of them even 3rd generation Western countries, NATO members. They still had that mindset of insecurity. They are important lessons that the Americans, the French, the British, the Norwegians, we need to keep being reminded of, that not everyone has our history. Our histories are bloody, and our histories are full of conflict and tensions, but we've not ever had that problem of fear of the consequences for you, your family, for your community of saying the wrong thing. So there are my lessons.
Thank you so much for your answers.
You're welcome.
Please, Oleg.
Well, once more, I want to express my gratitude, our gratitude for such an indispensable experience you provide for us. And my question will be devoted to the role of propaganda and various narratives which Russia continues to distribute despite various sanctions and constraints. So after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, what is the extent of influence of Russian propaganda now in Europe, for example, in European region, in the countries of NATO? Because we all know, obviously, they want to discourage them from helping us, and to so overall they fight against us in informational confrontation. So the question is, what is the extent of influence now in comparison to the past, in comparison to the previous years? And where do we Ukrainians stand nowadays, in your opinion, in the informational war against Russia? Thank you.
Well, even before the war, perhaps post 2014, the West has been sending its IT, its cybersecurity specialists to Ukraine to monitor and to learn what attacks were coming towards Ukraine, to help them prepare. If I'm honest, I think Russia has probably damaged itself and its standing in a way that is massively underestimated. It has created a solidarity across the European Union and across NATO. It has challenged countries to look at their energy and their over-reliance on Russian energy in a way that, no, it was being poo-pooed. I was at a conference in Germany not that long ago when the foreign minister stood up and said, we have no enemies. We are semi-detached from NATO. We have no enemies around us. I said, you heard of the Russians? I was, no, we can work with the Russians. Nobody believes that now. I was in a meeting when another MP challenged the Swedes and the Finns about why weren't they members of NATO. And I called the MP over and said, go and check what the Finns and the Swedes are doing in NATO while not members. They are doing more than some members. And now here they are, they want to be members. And indeed, Finland is. So in many respects for Russia, this war has unified and woken people up in a way that no one, in ordinary diplomatic terms, you could not have moved NATO as far as you have in the past year. It is amazing. Public opinion. Well, I can tell you what makes the difference in Britain, and I'll tell you why, and the images that were critical. And it's a very, very simplistic thing. But people talked about seeing people fleeing for their lives. And the things that, the small things that were critical to take with them. Your children with their favorite toy. The one suitcase. But for Britain, I can't speak for other countries, but for Britain, it was the biggie. It was taking their cats and their dogs. We are a very sentimental race when it comes to our animals and our pets. But seeing people racing for their lives, but still the family dog was coming or the family cat was coming. That meant these are people like us. And that was the message. So that Ukraine moved from people's imaginations from being somewhere over there on the map to being in Central Europe. Because visuals matter. And the brutality of the destruction has shocked new generations in Europe who had thought that was long behind us. And the strength of your commitment and your determination has been humbling, I would say, for most people. So that is how you're seen. You are admired. And people do want to do what they can to help. And I don't see that changing either. There will always be people out there who will say, oh, there needs to be peace. You know, Ukraine should be looking to sign up to a peace deal. But most people are willing to say no. When Ukraine is ready, Ukraine will make that decision and we will support them. Hope that helps.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, please, Кирило, Дені Коробко, Согоняко Софія, and last, Микита Кузьменко.
Excuse me, I've got an awful cold and you might have spotted it, but every now and again, I'm trying to stop myself sneezing.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Medellin Mун. I'm glad to see you and thank you for British support, especially thanks, challengers. And my question will be, like China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia, it's the main threat right now. And probably it will be a future challenge for global security, as for me, in my opinion. And if the war will start probably in Taiwan or on the territory of Japan, I don't know, will NATO join it together, or some countries, in your opinion, will say, oh no, it's not my deal, I will not join this war, because before that, there was Ukraine. I don't want to join this. Thank you.
To be honest, I think you underestimate the message that Ukraine is sending. Because there was an expectation that Ukraine would fall without really a battle. Kiev would be taken, a puppet government would be put in place, and game over. That was the expectation from Russia. If I'm honest, there was possibly some expectation that that's what might happen in some European capitals. You astounded the world. And what that means is that people think twice now. And yes, you are right in that grouping. But Japan has had virtually no military presence outside of Japan since 1945. Japan is now thinking differently. America is thinking differently. NATO is thinking differently. So it is a different world that we are all in. And it's also why it is important that we remain with Ukraine. In a very selfish way, that is a massive motivation to make sure that you cannot win by attacking smaller nations. One of the things that has been said has been that there's been some disappointment in how many nations have refused to back Ukraine and to criticize Russia. But those small nations are also looking and wondering what happens if they're next. And they have to see that values matter and that alliances matter. And that people will stand in solidarity. And I think that's also a big message for countries in Asia, as much as for countries in the wider Europe. So don't underestimate the longer term decisions that will be made about future battles based on the experience of Ukraine. And there are people who would never, ever have imagined a future out from the Russian umbrella or the Chinese umbrella, who now dream. And you facilitated that dream. So we wait and see what the future brings, but with knowledge and experience that has taught us much. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, good day, Mrs. Medelin Mun. Your thoughts and the lecture are the greatest support for the future of our new political and scientific generation. Thank you very much. I want to know your personal opinion. Which option for the global security is better? After war, of course, reorganizing global alliances or organizations like NATO and UN, or should the world think about organizing smaller regional organizations with support of the great one? We know that some NATO allies have their own interest and play their own political games with Russia even now. But for example, the Baltic states have an incredible amount interest in common with Ukraine. So maybe we can become an alliance in the other organizations. Yeah.
Okay, so all of that, I would say, in all honesty, all of that. Because even within NATO, you have subgroupings. So yes, you have the alliance of the Baltic and the Nordic states, but also in that, within NATO, it's called the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force. And Britain is a member of the Joint Expeditionary Force. And their focus is on a protection of the North, and in particular, the High North, because the opening up of the Arctic Sea brings a whole new set of complications. Alliances matter and groupings matter. Sometimes they can be, so Britain and France have something called the Lancaster House Agreement, which is an agreement on working together to develop particular capabilities and to working in an alliance. Britain is outside of NATO, but still in the Lancaster House Agreement. Hopefully, from my perspective, we'll be back in the European Union very quickly. But Britain is in alliance also at the same time with Italy and Japan to make a new joint fighter. So it's like life. The more friendships you've got, the better your life is. The UN is desperate for reform, absolutely desperate for reform. And I think let me see, 10 years ago, I was in a meeting where we were discussing whether or not Britain and France should give up their vetoes on the UN Security Council. But there's no point in us giving those up unless China and Russia and America give up their vetoes. So my personal view is that Security Council has to be reformed and it has to be widened. But we're not going to sort that one out in this meeting. But yes, there is much for your generation, not me, your generation, to put right. I leave that problem with you to resolve.
Yeah, I'm really happy for this answer. Thank you very much. I'm proud of us. Yeah.
Sophia, please. Please, Sophia. And Maketa next.
Thank you. So firstly, thank you for your very interesting and really important speech. I would like to ask about the alliance of Ukraine, Great Britain, and Poland. You founded in 2022, just before the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So how the officials in the United Kingdom see the future of such forms of cooperation and the overall strategic importance of this alliance, and what can Great Britain and Ukraine gain from this cooperation between our countries? Thank you.
I think Britain has a long history of close working with Poland. The Poles were critical to the defense of the UK, particularly in our Air Force during the Second World War. We have many, many Polish families living in the UK. So there are all sorts of long-lasting alliances between Britain and Poland. Governments come and governments go. And alliances and friendships, they change and they morph. But history also counts. So where you have a history of working together, and especially where you have a history of your military training together, it is vitally important. We tend to think in terms of diplomacy that they're ambassadors and they are the Foreign Office. But in keeping peace, diplomacy works at lots of different levels. So the business community is critical because business does not like disruption. It likes peace, it likes stability, it likes the rule of law, it likes things to be predictable. And they are great advocates for peace. The parliamentarians on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, they are diplomats working for that peace. Now, in the future, I don't know where you're going to work, but you might be doctors and you'll be going to international meetings, learning from other doctors. You might work as human rights defenders. And again, be part of that international family pushing for change. You might not go to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, but you might go to the OSCE and work there. You might work in election reform. Wherever you go, you are not just going to be in Ukraine. You are going to be reaching out, making alliances, and learning new ways of doing things. So yes, you have historic links with Poland and Lithuania. They will continue to matter, just as they continue to matter to the UK. But you never stop learning and you never stop making alliances. And never, ever think it's somebody else's responsibility. Don't just leave it to the politicians. Every one of you will have a role in keeping and maintaining the peace. Even when you go on holiday. And I apologize for sometimes the drinking behavior of our own young people from the UK, who sometimes are not our best ambassadors. But how people see your country matters. And history matters, but so does experience of day-to-day working with people in your own working field, to feel there is a common bond and a common trust. I'm not sure if I've made that clear enough. I don't know if what I'm saying comes over particularly well. Can somebody nod and say they know what I'm talking about? Oh, nobody's nodding. Did that make any sense?
Maketa, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Moon, for such a lecture. I would like to ask you that you was the president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, the time when Donald Trump occupied the White House. So my question would be, what was the attitude to such extraordinary United States president inside the NATO members community? Thank you very much.
Okay, so I was in Washington in 2017 for the inauguration with the NATO Assembly, and we had a meeting to look at what was a war game. And the war game that we were expecting was not an invasion of Ukraine at all. The expectation and the fear was a Russian army coming into the Baltic states. And that was what we were there to look at. How would we respond? What would be the critical things? And during a coffee break, I went to the bathrooms. And when I came out, there was a senior official from a civil servant, we would call them, who I'd met many times. And he said, I'm sorry to follow you to the bathroom, but we are very worried about this administration. And we need to know our friends will be with us, because we don't know if our constitution is going to be strong enough to withstand the attack on our values and our standards. And I said, your friends will be with you. Don't worry, we will all be there. And we were. So nobody was, on the whole, standing up and criticizing because he was a directly elected president of the United States. And actually, under Donald Trump, Europe did very well. We had more money for NATO. We had more military personnel for NATO than under President Obama. But conversations, and Oksana, you might well remember these conversations with Americans, with the American colleagues, was very robust. And the conversations changed over the time from being, Trump is a great president and we back him and he's going to do great things for America, to I'm not responsible for talking for Donald Trump. He can talk for himself. So there was a sort of backing away. You cannot attack a directly elected president and say, that person's no good. But what you can say is, we are deeply concerned about. And those conversations gather weight and are heard. And it is important for those who are fighting for change to know that they have people who support that fight for change and who support the values. And it's always, in the end, it always comes down to values and standards that are expected across the international community. I hope that helped. Did that answer the question?
Thank you very much, dear Medellin. It's very interesting, and thank you for inspire these young people, because it is very important, this meeting in this model, young people parliamentary assembly. And welcome to Ukraine after war, and my city in Lviv and Kiev. And thank you very much. We had this meeting with 100 young people, and thank you. Next visit online and offline, and thank you very much. It is my good friend and my big friend, and I very love you.
Thank you. And I will end where I started. My generation is leaving your generation with lots of problems. But I promise you, you leave your children with lots of problems as well, because that is the story of human existence. It is a constant battle to improve life. But never think it's not your responsibility. Whatever your job is, whatever your role is in life, as Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. Good luck to you all. Keep safe. And I promise you, your friends are with you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good luck to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much.
So much.
A delight.
Yeah, thank you. Be care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Ми будемо мати, ще поки ви є, хвилиночку завтра, але не о 16:00, а о 17:00. Боже, ми матимемо зустріч з Олею Стефанишиною, віце-прем'єр-міністром з європейської євроатлантичної інтеграції. Я вас дуже прошу бути вчасно, тому що насправді дуже складно тим, хто є діючий сьогодні в уряді чи в парламенті, їм підлаштовуватися. Я вам скажу відверто, це такі вибудовування. 2 година, 5 година, тобто обрали 5 годину завтра. Оптимальний варіант. Зараз після цієї лекції буде оголошення. Це буде дуже гарна можливість. Оля Стефанишина працювала багато, фактично всі 5 років заступником в Іванни Климпуш-Цинцадзе, у нас в Комітеті європейської інтеграції. Це реально дуже крутий політик, який виростав по щаблях, і тому це буде така унікальна можливість зустрітися з діючим політиком, який займається в Україні. Але не забувайте тих слів, які говорила сьогодні Меделін Мун, що насправді не покладайтеся на політиків, а самі робіть свою країну, самі беріть в цьому участь. Тому для того ми мусимо з вами дуже бути активними, коли прийде час, щоб ви були готові після перемоги цим займатися, можливо, ще і під час всього процесу. Тому дивіться, до завтра. Я не ставила перед тим жодної іншої лекції, тому що мені важливо, щоб ми включились трошки раніше і були на зв'язку, і в 17:00 отримали цю лекцію на годину, яку виділила віце-прем'єр-міністр для нашої зустрічі, а у середу, скоріше за все, що у вас буде 2 години зустрічей з 2 людьми, що ми встигли зустрітися з усіма. Так що дякую вам за зустріч, сподіваюся, що вам було цікаво.
Дуже вам дякуємо.
Дякую. До побачення.
Дякую, до побачення.